In one thread, humanity wages an eternal war against the forces of hell. Demons, possessed soldiers, and ancient evils that have consumed entire dimensions in rivers of fire and suffering. In that thread, one warrior stands between extinction and survival. Not because he was chosen, not because destiny demanded it, but because he refused to stop. He has torn through Phobos, through Necrovol, through the very corridors of hell itself, and leaving nothing behind but silence and the scattered remains of creatures that once believed themselves immortal. The demons have a word for him, written in their oldest texts, spoken only in whispers when they believe nothing is listening. Doomslayer. In another thread, quieter, grayer, rotting slowly from the inside out, humanity fell to something far less dramatic than demonic invasion. No portals opened, no ancient evil made its proclamation. People simply died, and then they got back up. And the world ended not with fire, but with a low, endless moan that never stopped. Welcome to what remains. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The rift opened without ceremony. There was no pillar of light, no thunderclap announcement, no cosmic herald to explain what was happening. One moment the air above a stretch of Georgia highway was the same it had always been since the fall, thick with humidity, carrying the faint sweetness of decay that the survivors had long since stopped noticing. Then the air split, not like glass cracking, not like fabric tearing, but like something that had never been meant to open was being forced apart by sheer will, by momentum, by a body traveling at a velocity that dimensions simply couldn't hold back any longer. The rift lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the highway was bathed in light, the color of argent energy, deep orange bleeding into violent crimson. And a sound rolled across the Georgia wilderness that sent every walker within half a mile turning toward it with fresh hunger. Then the rift closed, and the Doomslayer hit the asphalt. He landed in a combat crouch, one gauntleted fist driving into the road, hard enough to crack the surface in a spiderweb pattern beneath his knuckles. The Praetor Suit systems cycled immediately. Pressure seals confirming integrity, threat assessment protocols scanning the environment, heads-up diagnostics running a rapid audit of dimensional transition damage. Minor hull stress along the left pauldron, negligible. He straightened. The Georgia sun hit him like something confused by his presence, pouring down on green-black argent-reinforced armor that had absorbed the light of hell's furnaces and reflected it back at full intensity. The highway stretched in both directions. Fractured asphalt littered with abandoned vehicles, their windows long since shattered, their interiors colonized by vines and rust. A minivan sat jackknifed across the center lane with its doors hanging open, a child sneaker visible in the grass 20 feet away. A tanker truck had burned and cooled into a blackened skeleton that the kudzu was slowly consuming. The infrastructure of a civilization that had simply stopped mid-sentence. He processed all of this in under 2 seconds. Then he processed the smell. Not brimstone, not sulfur, not the particular chemical signature of demon ichor or argent corruption. This was something different. Biological decay, operating on a specific frequency his combat instincts recognized as wrong, in the same way a tuning fork recognizes a discordant note. Rotting meat that was still moving. He had encountered undead before in Hell's corridors. Revenants, Hell Knights with necrotic tissue wrapped around demonic cores. But those smelled like hell. This smelled like Earth, like human beings in the process of becoming something else. The first walker emerged from behind the tanker truck. It had been a man once, middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing the tattered remains of a mechanic's jumpsuit with a name patch that said Gary in cheerful red stitching. Gary's eyes were the color of curdled milk. Gary's jaw worked in a repetitive grinding motion as the scent of living flesh, still warm, still carrying the electromagnetic signature of a beating heart, registered in whatever passed for his brain. Gary began to walk toward the Doomslayer with the unhurried confidence of something that had forgotten what it meant to be afraid. The Slayer watched him for exactly 1 second, not out of hesitation. The Slayer did not hesitate. He was cataloging. The movement pattern, slow, uncoordinated, driven entirely by stimulus rather than thought. No tactical awareness, no defensive posturing, no recognition of threat differential. Gary was not a demon. Gary carried none of the Argent signature, none of the hell energy, none of the corrupted soul matter that marked everything the Slayer had spent an eternity destroying. None was almost casual. A single economical was almost casual. A single economical strike. The heel of his gauntleted palm connecting with Gary's skull with approximately 1/8 of the force the Slayer used against standard hell soldiers. The sound was sharp and final. Gary dropped and did not get back up. The Slayer looked at his hand for a moment, recalibrating force parameters. Fragile. Then the moan behind him registered. Not one voice, but many. The collective drone of a horde drawn by the Argent Rift's noise and light signature, emerging from the tree line on both sides of the highway. He counted them in the half-second it took to reach back and close his hand around the grip of the super shotgun. 240, give or take. The Slayer rolled his neck once, the Praetor Suit's servos humming with the motion, and then he walked toward them. What followed was not a battle. Battles imply some degree of contest, some possibility that either side might lose. This was closer to weather, an unstoppable natural force moving through a landscape and reshaping it without anger, without passion, without any particular emotion at all. The super shotgun fired in controlled pairs, each discharge punching through 2 and 3 walkers simultaneously, skulls detonating in dark mist. When the press became too dense for efficient shooting, the Slayer switched to the chainsaw. Not for the fuel conservation protocol he maintained in hell. This wasn't hell. There were no demon souls to harvest for ammunition. But because the walkers were packed tightly enough that melee was faster. The chainsaw's teeth shrieked through the Georgia afternoon. He moved through the horde the way water moves through a cracked dam, not around it, but through it, always forward, always decisive. 11 minutes later, the highway was quiet again. The Slayer stood at the far edge of the horde's remnants and surveyed what remained. He was unmarked. His suit showed no new damage. His breathing was measured and calm. He cataloged the threat assessment with the same dispassion he applied to everything. Not demons. Dead humans. Dangerous in mass numbers. Individually negligible. Primary threat classification. Environmental hazard. In the tree line to the north, 60 yards back, tucked behind a rusted pickup truck with both doors removed and a hand-painted white letter A on the hood. A scout watched him through binoculars with hands that had gone completely still. The scout's name was Paul Monroe. Most people called him Jesus. And Jesus, who had seen things in this dead world that no human being should ever have to see, slowly lowered his binoculars and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "What in the hell is that?" Paul Monroe had survived the apocalypse through a combination of skills that most people couldn't fully categorize until they were already on the ground wondering what happened. He was fast, genuinely, unnervingly fast for someone who looked like he'd wandered out of a Renaissance fair. He was observant in the way that only people who had learned that inattention meant death could be observant. And he was, above almost everything else, pragmatic. He had watched communities rise and collapse. He had seen what happened when people encountered something they didn't understand and reacted with fear instead of patience. He had also seen what happened when people extended trust too quickly to the wrong thing. He spent 45 seconds completely motionless behind the pickup truck, watching the armored figure stand in the center of the highway, surrounded by 240 destroyed walkers, and he ran every calculation he had. It's human. The proportions were right. Bipedal, with 2 arms, moving with coordination and intent that no walker ever demonstrated. It's armored, not scavenged body armor, not the patchwork protection that settlements cobbled together from motorcycle gear and sporting equipment. This was something else entirely. Seamless, industrial, the kind of engineering that suggested either pre-fall military black budget programs or something that had no business existing in this world at all. It's dangerous. That required no analysis whatsoever, and the evidence was arranged across 200 yards of Georgia highway in visceral detail. He radioed Alexandria. "This is Jesus. I need Rick, now." Rick Grimes received the description in pieces, the way all truly destabilizing information arrives. First the outline, then the details, then the full weight of implication settling onto his shoulders like something physical. An armored figure. Alone. 240 walkers destroyed in under 15 minutes without apparent injury. I'm standing on Route 85, approximately 12 miles from Alexandria's walls, facing north, not moving. Rick stood in Alexandria's makeshift command room, a converted dining room with maps pinned to every wall and a hand-drawn census of every able-bodied fighter they had, and looked at Michonne, who was already looking at him. "Could be military," she said. "Not a conclusion, a starting point." "Military's been gone for 3 years," Rick said. "Pre-fall military projects. Something that was sealed up just came back online." Daryl was leaning against the doorframe, crossbow slung, expression doing what Daryl's expressions always did, communicating volumes through minimal movement. "Jesus said it walked through the Horde, didn't go around, didn't wait, just walked through." "That's not a person," said one of the newer council members from the back of the room. And his voice carried the particular pitch of someone who had already made up their mind and was looking for agreement rather than discussion. "Whatever that is, we should stay away from it. Let it keep moving." Rick turned and looked at him with the patient, weathered expression of a man who had stopped having simple reactions to complex situations sometime around the 3rd year of the apocalypse. "If it's dangerous and moving north," Rick said, "it's moving toward us. And if it's something we can potentially communicate with." He let the second half of that sentence sit unfinished in the room. Because everyone in that room had lived through Negan, had lived through the governor, had lived through every catastrophic failure of human communication that the apocalypse had served up. And they all knew what the alternative to communication looked like. He looked back at Michonne. "Get the car. We're going to meet it." The Doomslayer had not moved from the center of the highway. This was not passivity. The Slayer didn't do passivity. It was tactical assessment. The same methodical stillness he applied when entering any new environment, cataloging variables before committing to a direction. He had swept the immediate area twice already. No further walker clusters within the range his combat instincts could detect. No demonic energy signatures anywhere. He had been running that scan continuously since arrival, the Praetor Suit sensors searching for the argent corruption that would indicate a hell incursion and finding nothing. Nothing. The absence was more disorienting than any specific threat would have been. Hell was always there. Hell was the constant, the permanent backdrop against which everything else in his existence was arranged. Mode to scan the environment and find only silence where Hell's signature should be was like opening your eyes and discovering a color that didn't exist before. He looked down at his hands. The argent energy that reinforced every cell in his body still burned with its characteristic heat. He could feel it in his bones, in the enhanced musculature that the Lazarus Project and decades of demonic warfare had built into something that barely resembled the Marine he had once been. That was internal. What he drew from the environment to supplement it, the ambient hell energy that saturated every battlefield he'd ever fought on. That was absent here. He wasn't weakened, but he was operating on reserves rather than an active power source. The distinction mattered less than it would have for a normal fighter. For the Slayer, it was simply noted and filed. The car appeared on the southern horizon at 11:47 in the morning. A battered Jeep Cherokee, pre-fall, and running on what smelled like diluted fuel that had been stretched past its recommended limits. It came at moderate speed, not the reckless acceleration of an attack run, not the cautious crawl of extreme fear. Purposeful. The Slayer watched it cover the distance between the tree line and his position, and noted three things. One driver, one passenger in the front, one figure in the rear, with what appeared to be a Japanese sword across her lap. A fourth person, the one he had detected watching from the tree line earlier, had melted out of the tree line on foot and was pacing the vehicle at a distance that suggested he was serving as perimeter cover. Organized, disciplined, scared, but not panicking. The Jeep stopped 30 feet away. A long moment passed. Then the driver's door opened. Rick Grimes stepped out with his hands visible, not raised in full surrender, but open and away from the python holstered at his hip. A deliberate and practiced gesture that communicated, "I am not drawing," without communicating, "I am not dangerous." He had learned that specific body language from hard experience. He looked at the armored figure on the highway and kept his expression as neutral as he could manage, which took more effort than he would have admitted to anyone in that Jeep. He had seen a lot of things in 3 years of apocalypse. He had never seen anything that looked like this. "My name is Rick Grimes," he said. His voice was steady. The apocalypse had done many things to Rick Grimes, but it had not taken his voice. "We have a community nearby. We're not here to threaten you." He paused, reading the absolute stillness of the figure in front of him and the way he had learned to read everything in this world. As information, as signal, as data to be processed before the next move. "We'd like to talk." The Doomslayer looked at Rick Grimes for a long moment. Rick Grimes looked back, and the Georgia sun sat between them like a held breath. Then, with the slow deliberation of something that had decided, not capitulated, decided, the Slayer took one step forward. Michonne's hand didn't move toward her sword. She'd been watching his hands since the moment he came into view, and his hands had not moved toward his weapons either. She filed that away as the most important piece of information she'd collected all morning. Daryl, from the rear seat, he exhaled very quietly through his nose. Jesus, from the tree line, allowed himself to blink. Rick held his ground as 250 pounds of argent-enhanced armor covered the distance between them, stopped 6 feet away, and regarded him with eyes that, through the visor, carried something Rick had not expected to find there. Not hostility, not confusion, not the blankness of something that had lost its humanity. Recognition. This being looked at Rick Grimes and recognized. Just on some fundamental level, a soldier. Someone who had been through the kind of war that leaves permanent marks on everything it touches. Rick didn't know what to do with that exactly. But it was a place to start. Communication, Rick had learned, was rarely about words. In the first year of the apocalypse, when the world was still raw and people were still operating on the assumption that civilization might reassemble itself if they just waited long enough. He had believed that language was the primary tool of human connection. Explanations, negotiations, agreements. The architecture of society built from sentences. Then the governor happened. Then Terminus happened. Then Negan happened, and Rick Grimes had learned, with the particular thoroughness that only repeated catastrophic experience can teach, that what people did communicated everything that what people said tried to obscure. The armored figure had not drawn a weapon. In this world, that was a complete sentence. He had gestured, not with the elaborate sign language of someone trying to perform non-threat, but with the economical efficiency of someone accustomed to communicating in environments where verbal language wasn't an option. A single motion toward the destroyed walker horde, then a flat palm facing outward. I dealt with the threat. I am not the threat. Rick had understood it immediately, the same way he understood Daryl's silences and Michonne's expressions. Because in the apocalypse, you learned to read the language underneath language, or you died. And on either side, the vehicle's suspension on either side. The vehicle's suspension registering his weight with an audible groan that made Daryl grip the door handle reflexively. He had looked out the window the entire drive, not with the wide-eyed disorientation of someone encountering an alien world. With the systematic, rotating scan of someone cataloging terrain, marking defensive positions, logging escape routes. Professional, automatic. The same survey he would have run entering any new sector of hell. Alexandria looked, to the Doomslayer's combat-calibrated perception, like a fortified civilian settlement in the early stages of organized defense. The walls were solid, reinforced, layered, maintained with the care of people who understood that the walls were the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. The guard posts showed real discipline, in spacing and sight lines that suggested someone with genuine tactical training had designed the layout. The interior, houses, a small infirmary, a modest armory, communal spaces, carried the specific texture of a community that had survived long enough to develop culture. Children's drawings pinned to a community board, a vegetable garden in careful rows, 2 teenagers arguing about something near a water barrel with a magnificent disregard for consequences that only genuine safety could produce. He stood in the center of Alexandria's main courtyard and let them look at him. They looked. Every resident who could find a reason to be outside was outside, maintaining the polite fiction of going about their business while actually conducting a comprehensive stare. He was used to being looked at. In hell, being looked at meant something was about to attack him. Here the looking carried a different texture. Fear, yes, but also the particular human hunger for information. The desperate need to categorize and understand that survivors developed when the unknown became synonymous with death. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood at the edge of the courtyard with absolutely no regard for the social contract that was keeping every adult at a careful distance. She looked at the Slayer with a direct, unfiltered assessment that only children and experienced combatants deploy. Then she looked at Rick. "Is he staying?" she asked. Rick crouched down to her level with the practiced ease of a father. "We're still figuring that out, Judith." She looked back at the Slayer. "He killed a lot of walkers?" "He did." "Good," she said, with the serene practicality of someone who had grown up in the apocalypse and had no framework for a world where that wasn't the relevant metric. And the saviors arrived at 2 in the afternoon. There were 14 of them. Standard tribute collection crew, 3 vehicles, the particular swagger of people who had internalized their own power so completely that they'd stopped checking whether it was still valid. Rick had been expecting them. The scheduled collection was overdue by 2 days, delayed by a walker cluster that had taken longer to clear than anticipated. And Negan's people didn't accommodate delays with patience. They came through Alexandria's gate with the comfortable authority of landlords conducting an inspection, the lead enforcer, a wide man named Wade, who wore his cruelty the way other people wore cologne, already running his eyes across the courtyard's inventory before the vehicles had fully stopped. Wade saw the Slayer and stopped walking. The 14 saviors behind him performed a small, involuntary accordion compression as they registered what their lead was staring at. Rick watched Wade's face cycle through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, attempted professional assessment, something that was working very hard not to be fear, and finally settling on the aggressive bluster that insecure authority always defaulted to when it felt the ground shifting beneath it. "The hell is that?" Wade said, not as a question. "New addition to the community," Rick said. "Negan doesn't get notified about new additions?" Wade said, or he was still looking at the Slayer, but his voice was aimed at Rick with the practiced menace of someone running a script. "Negan likes to know about new additions. Negan especially likes to know about..." He gestured vaguely at the Praetor Suit. "Resources." The Doomslayer had been still since the saviors entered the gate. Not the stillness of someone standing down, the stillness of someone tracking. His visor had swept across all 14 individuals the moment they entered, cataloging weapons, stances, threat assessments, behavioral patterns. He had registered the power dynamic immediately, not from any cultural knowledge of this world's specific politics, but from the universal body language of coercion. He had seen it in Hell's hierarchy. He had seen it in the UAC's corporate structure before he destroyed that too. Predators and the people predators fed on looked the same in every universe. Wade made the mistake of walking toward him, but not aggressively, not yet. Just the territorial advance of someone establishing dominance through proximity. The same move that worked on frightened survivors and intimidated communities, and had never, in Wade's operational experience, failed to communicate the correct message. He got within 10 feet of the Slayer and stopped, because something in the autonomous threat detection system that every living creature carries in their brainstem sent up a signal that his conscious mind was still trying to override. The Slayer turned his visor toward Wade. Wade had faced walkers. He had faced desperate survivors with nothing to lose. He had stood beside Negan when Negan introduced Lucille to people who had believed, right up until the last moment, that something would intervene. He knew what it felt like to be in the presence of violence. This was something categorically different. This was what violence felt like when it had been doing nothing else for longer than Wade had been alive, when it had been refined and concentrated and compressed into a single entity that regarded him the way a force of nature regards an obstacle. Not with malice, not with anger, but with the complete, patient certainty of something that would still be here after he wasn't. Jesus, watching from the second floor. Jesus, watching from the second floor window of the house across the courtyard, saw it and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that felt, cautiously and against his better judgment, like hope. "We're here for the collection," Wade said, and then his voice had lost approximately 30% of its previous confidence without his full permission. "Standard schedule." Rick nodded. "We'll get it together." Wade looked at the Slayer one more time. The Slayer had returned to his environmental scan, apparently having finished his assessment of Wade and filed it under a category that didn't require further attention. Wade's jaw tightened at being dismissed so completely by something that hadn't even spoken. "Negan's going to want to know about this," he said. "I figured," Rick said. The collection proceeded. Rick watched the saviors load supplies into their vehicles with the hollow, practiced numbness of someone who had made peace with a situation they hadn't yet found the means to change. He watched the Slayer watch the saviors. Gandhi thought about what it meant that 14 armed men who made other communities shake, had walked into Alexandria, and one of them had taken an involuntary step backward from something that hadn't even moved. He thought about what Negan would do when Wade reported back. He thought about what the Slayer would do when Negan came personally. He wasn't sure which possibility required more preparation. Negan arrived on a Thursday. Rick knew it was going to be a personal visit the moment the scout on the east wall radioed in the vehicle count. 7 cars and the truck, which was Negan's traveling configuration when he wanted to make a statement rather than simply conduct business. Standard collection runs were 3 vehicles. 5 vehicles meant there was a problem to be addressed. 7 vehicles and the truck meant Negan had decided that the problem required an audience, required theater, yet required the full weight of his personal mythology deployed at maximum effect. Rick had learned to read Negan's operational language the same way he'd learned to read everything else in this world. As information, as signal, as data that needed to be processed before the next move. He had 11 minutes between the scout's radio call and the convoy's arrival at Alexandria's gate. He used them. "Whatever happens," Rick said to Michonne, standing at the gate with his hands loose at his sides and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality that Negan's visits required. "Don't intervene unless I give the signal." "And the Slayer?" Michonne said. Rick looked across the courtyard to where the armored figure stood near the armory. The same position he'd occupied for most of the past 2 days. Close enough to the community's defensive core to suggest protective instinct, and far enough from the residential areas to suggest he understood the anxiety his presence created. He had spent those 2 days doing 3 things. Conducting systematic perimeter sweeps that had reduced Alexandria's walker encounters to essentially 0. Sitting in complete stillness for hours at a time, in a way that the community had gradually stopped finding alarming and started finding oddly reassuring, and then consuming truly staggering quantities of whatever food Alexandria could provide with the mechanical regularity of a body running extremely high-output biological systems. He had not spoken. Not because he couldn't. The Slayer had a voice, buried somewhere under decades of warfare and a relationship with language that had been reduced to operational necessity. But in this world, in this community, he had assessed that words were less useful than presence, and his presence had been communicating clearly. "Let him make his own choices," Rick said. The gate opened. Negan stepped out of the truck with the practiced cadence of a performer who had spent years perfecting his entrance. Lucille resting on his shoulder, leather jacket catching the afternoon light, smile deployed at full wattage, eyes doing the actual work of rapid environmental assessment behind the performance of relaxed authority. But he had built his entire power structure on a specific psychological principle, that the anticipation of violence was more controllable than violence itself. Keep people in the moment just before the worst thing happens, and they'll do anything to prevent the worst thing from happening. It was elegant in its way, sustainable, a renewable resource. He saw the Slayer and his stride didn't break. Negan was good. Rick had to give him that. Whatever internal recalibration happened behind those eyes when they landed on 250 pounds of argent black armor standing in the center of Alexandria's courtyard. Whatever alarm system fired in the part of Negan's brain that had kept him alive through the apocalypse and through the specific brutality of building an empire from nothing. None of it reached his face. His smile didn't waver. His pace didn't change. He walked toward Rick with the complete, committed performance of a man who had decided that the correct response to the inexplicable was to act like it was exactly what he'd expected. "Rick," he said, spreading his free arm wide in the gesture of magnanimous arrival he'd developed into an art form. "I heard you had company." "Negan?" Rick said. Negan's eyes slid sideways to the Slayer, with the casual deliberateness of someone who had decided to address the largest variable in the room on his own timeline. And he looked the Praetor's suit up and down with an expression of theatrical appreciation. The same expression he used on Lucille, on his own reflection, on anything he'd decided to incorporate into his personal mythology. "Now that," Negan said, "is a hell of a get-up." The Slayer said nothing. Negan waited the precise number of seconds that a man accustomed to controlling conversational rhythm waits before deciding that silence is a challenge rather than a response. Then he walked toward the Slayer with Lucille still on his shoulder and his smile still fully operational. Because Negan had built his empire on the foundational principle that he never showed uncertainty. And he wasn't about to let a silent suit of armor become the first thing that broke that record. He stopped 8 feet away. "I'm Negan," he said. "Everybody's Negan, eventually. You'll figure that out." He tilted his head, examining the visor with genuine curiosity working behind the performance. "Wade tells me you took out about 240 walkers on Route 85 without breaking a sweat. That true?" The Slayer's visor tracked to Lucille, not to Negan's face, not to the armed saviors spreading casually across the courtyard in the practiced formation of people who had done this in many communities and knew exactly how much space to claim. To the bat, specifically to the barbed wire wrapped around it, now into the dark staining on the wire that had never been fully cleaned away. The Slayer held that look for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back at Negan. Negan felt something move through him that he would never have described out loud to anyone. Not fear. Negan had a complex relationship with fear that involved extensively redefining what the word meant. Something older than fear. Something that lived in the part of the human nervous system that predated conscious thought, was that fired when the organism registered a predator so far outside its experience that the normal threat response architecture simply had no category for it. He kept smiling. "Strong and silent," Negan said. "I can respect that. I've got guys like that. Big guys, quiet guys, guys who let the work speak for itself." He paused, letting the next sentence arrive with the weight he intended. "The thing is, in my organization, everybody contributes. Everybody pulls their weight. That's how we keep the lights on, Rick. You know this. And a resource like..." He gestured at the Slayer with Lucille, a proprietary gesture. The gesture of a man accustomed to claiming things by indicating them. "This does not exist outside my organization. That's just how it works." Rick said nothing. Negan turned back to the Slayer with the expression of a man making a generous offer. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to the sanctuary. You're going to see what we've built. You're going to understand how things work in this world. And then you're going to make the smart choice, because..." The Slayer moved, not toward Negan, not a threatening advance. He simply closed the distance between himself and Lucille in one step, one single, unhurried step, and wrapped his gauntleted hand around the barrel of the bat where it rested on Negan's shoulder. Negan went absolutely still. Every savior in the courtyard had a weapon up in under 2 seconds. Rifles, pistols, all aimed at the armored figure with the professional speed of people who had drilled this response until it was reflexive. Rick's hand moved toward his python without fully committing. Michonne was on her feet. Daryl's crossbow was up. The Slayer held Lucille. Not pulling, not twisting, not threatening. simply holding. One gauntleted hand around the weapon with a grip that communicated, with absolute physical clarity, that if he chose to, the bat and everything it represented would cease to exist in its current form. He held it for 5 full seconds, while Negan's smile remained frozen on his face, and the Savior's fingers rested on triggers, and Alexandria held its collective breath. Then he released it, stepped back, returned to his position near the armory, resumed his environmental scan as if nothing had occurred. Negan lowered Lucille slowly. His smile came back online, but it had changed. The performance was the same, but something behind it was running different calculations now. He looked at Rick with an expression that had shed approximately half of its theater. "Interesting friend you've got," he said. His voice was steady. His voice was always steady. But he did not make another proprietary gesture toward the Slayer for the remainder of his visit. And when the convoy left Alexandria 40 minutes later with its standard tribute loaded into the truck, Anna Wade, watching from the passenger seat, noticed that Negan didn't speak for the first 11 miles of the drive back. That had never happened before. Not once. The ammunition situation presented itself as a mathematical problem with an uncomfortable solution. The Doomslayer had been running inventory since the second day. A continuous, automatic audit that the Praetor Suit systems maintained alongside every other operational parameter. The dimensional storage that housed his arsenal had survived the transition intact, which meant he had arrived in this world with full loadout, super shotgun with a reserve that would have been generous for any normal engagement, chainsaw with sufficient fuel for sustained use, rocket launcher, heavy cannon, ballista, BFG 9000. In Hell, ammunition replenishment was a solved problem. Demon corpses yielded usable rounds through the Slayer's glory kill system, the physical act of executing enemies at close range triggering a biological and mechanical process that converted demon matter into compatible ammunition. It was elegant, self-sustaining, the perfect closed loop for an eternal war. The walkers did not yield ammunition. He had tested this on the 3rd day with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to all operational unknowns, engaging a walker cluster of 12 at close range, running glory kill protocols, finding nothing recoverable. The bodies were human biological matter in advanced decay. No demonic core, no argent energy to harvest, no compatible material for conversion. The glory kill system recognized the absence and simply didn't fire. He had stood over the cluster results and run the calculation with the dispassion of a logistics officer reviewing supply projections. At his current engagement rate, which was low, as because Alexandria's walker encounters had dropped dramatically since his arrival, and he was operating with deliberate conservation. He had approximately 3 weeks of full arsenal operation before he needed to begin selective rationing. 6 weeks before critical systems went to reserve only. After that, he was operating on melee and whatever this world could physically provide. He had begun preparing for that reality on day 4. Alexandria had a workshop, a converted garage that served as the community's primary fabrication and repair space, staffed primarily by a former civil engineer named Eugene Porter, who had the specific combination of genuine technical intelligence and profound social awkwardness that the apocalypse tended to either eliminate quickly or preserve in amber indefinitely. Eugene had survived, which said something about the specific utility of his particular skill set, and the Slayer had appeared in the workshop doorway on the morning of day 4 and stood there until Eugene turned around. Eugene Porter's relationship with fear was, by his own extensive internal documentation, a complex and evolving narrative. He had been afraid of almost everything for most of his life, had constructed an elaborate architecture of manipulation and misdirection to compensate for it, and had spent the apocalypse gradually discovering that the architecture was less necessary than he'd believed. He was still afraid of quite a lot of things. The armored figure filling his workshop doorway was objectively one of the most fear-inducing stimuli he had ever encountered. He pushed his glasses up his nose and said, "Can I help you?" The Slayer entered the workshop. He moved to the fabrication bench, looked at the available materials, scavenged metal stock, salvaged components, basic machining tools that Eugene had accumulated and maintained with the proprietary intensity of someone who understood exactly how irreplaceable they were, and picked up a length of rebar approximately 18 inches long. He held it for a moment, running his thumb along the ridged surface. Then he set it down and looked at Eugene with what Eugene would later describe to Rosita as the most focused, non-verbal communication I have ever experienced from any human being, or, apparently, whatever that is. "You want to make something," Eugene said. The Slayer picked up the rebar again. "With metal," Eugene said. "Something with metal. Something." He watched the Slayer's hands move through a motion that was, Eugene's pattern recognition systems noted with considerable alarm, clearly a practiced close-quarters combat technique for hitting things. The Slayer set the rebar down and waited. Eugene looked at his materials. He looked at the Slayer. He looked at his materials again with the expression of a man running rapid calculations about what was being requested and what he had the capacity to deliver and what the consequences of inadequate delivery might be. Then he pulled out a notepad, uncapped a pen, and said, "All right, walk me through the specifications." What emerged over the following 4 days was not a weapon in any conventional sense that Alexandria's community would have recognized. Eugene, you're working from the Slayer's demonstrated requirements. Weight tolerance that exceeded anything a normal human could wield effectively. Edge geometry designed for penetrating dense biological matter at the specific angles that destroyed walker brains most efficiently. Structural integrity sufficient to withstand repeated high-force impact without deformation. Produced something that he privately categorized as falling somewhere between a warhammer and a geological survey instrument. It was dense. It was brutal. It was, Eugene noted in his internal assessment, the most mechanically honest object he had ever fabricated, in the sense that it made no pretense about what it was for. The Slayer had tested it in the field on day 8 against a walker cluster of 30 that had drifted toward Alexandria's eastern wall. He had used no firearms. The super shotgun remained in dimensional storage. The chainsaw stayed cold. He worked through the cluster with the fabricated weapon and his gauntleted hands and the Praetor Suit's full physical capability. And the 30 walkers took 4 minutes and 20 seconds to resolve. And the Slayer emerged from the cluster with the weapon intact and his suit showing no new damage, and his ammunition reserves completely unchanged. Daryl had watched from the wall. He watched for the full 4 minutes and 20 seconds without moving, crossbow on his back, their forearms resting on the top of the wall in the posture of someone who had stopped pretending to be doing anything other than watching. When it was done, he stayed at the wall for another few minutes, processing. Then he went and found Rick. "He's adapting," Daryl said. Rick looked up from the map he'd been studying. Supply route projections, resource assessments, the endless logistical calculus of keeping a community alive. "What do you mean?" "His guns. Well, he's not using them as much." Daryl leaned against the doorframe. He went through 30 walkers with a metal club in his hands. Like he was... He paused, selecting the word carefully, conserving. Rick set the map down. "He knows his supplies are limited," Michonne said from the other side of the room, where she had been sharpening her katana with the meditative regularity she applied to it every evening. He's adjusting to what's available." "That's not something you do if you're planning to leave?" Rick said. The three of them sat with that for a moment. It's not something you do if you think of yourself as a guest either, Michonne said. Rick looked at the map, at the supply routes, at the red marks indicating savior checkpoints and the blue marks indicating communities under Negan's tribute system, and the careful, damning geometry of how completely Negan's network had enclosed every functioning settlement within 100 miles. He thought about the convoy that had left Alexandria 4 days ago. He thought about Negan's face in the moment the Slayer's hand had closed around Lucille. He thought about what it meant that the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered in this dead world had spent 8 days methodically learning how to operate within its constraints rather than above them. He's not a weapon, Rick said, firmly, preemptively. The way you said things that you needed everyone in the room to believe before you all did something that would be very easy to rationalize. Daryl said nothing, which was Daryl's way of disagreeing respectfully. Michonne kept sharpening her katana. Outside, in the early Georgia dark, the Doomslayer stood at Alexandria's wall and looked north, toward the sanctuary, toward Negan's empire, and toward the specific coordinates his combat instincts had been mapping since the convoy left, and said nothing, and thought his long, patient soldier's thoughts. The Whisperers had been watching Alexandria for 3 weeks. This was not unusual. The Whisperers watched everything. It was foundational to their philosophy. The patient, predatory observation that Alpha had cultivated in her people as both survival strategy and ideological statement. They were the dead. They moved with the dead. They saw what the dead saw, which was everything, because the living always forgot that the dead were watching. Communities built their walls and their schedules and their patrol routes and their supply runs with the assumption that the primary threat was the Horde. Mindless, directionless, manageable with sufficient discipline and adequate walls. They forgot that some threats wore the Horde as camouflage. Alpha had received the reports about Alexandria's new addition with the same expression she received all information, flat, considered, stripped of emotional response before being processed. The reports were inconsistent in ways that Alpha found professionally irritating. The scouts disagreed on basic physical parameters. One reported a figure of approximately normal human height and build in unusual armor. Another reported something substantially larger. A third, the most experienced field scout Alpha had filed a report that Alpha had read 3 times and then set aside without comment, most because the report described movement characteristics and engagement statistics that Alpha's operational framework had no productive way to incorporate. 240 walkers. Alone. 12 minutes. She had sent a 4-person assessment team on day 6. Walker camouflaged, disciplined, experienced. They had infiltrated the perimeter of Alexandria's standard patrol route and held position for 18 hours, observing. 3 of them came back. Note the 4th, a man named Cole, who had been with the Whisperers for 2 years and whom Alpha considered reliable, had simply stopped transmitting. The 3 who returned reported that Cole had been part of a small group moving with a walker cluster approximately 400 yards from Alexandria's eastern wall when the armored figure had emerged from the settlement on what appeared to be a routine perimeter sweep. The cluster had been 12 walkers. When the figure had engaged the cluster with melee weapons, efficiency over speed, systematic. Cole had been maintaining walker movement patterns, shuffling gait, arms loose, head down, the practiced mimicry that had kept Whisperers invisible for years. The figure had looked directly at Cole for approximately 2 seconds. Then it had walked toward him. Cole had broken cover and run, and this was a catastrophic protocol violation. Running was the single behavior guaranteed to distinguish a living person from a walker at any distance. But Cole had run because whatever the figure's 2-second assessment had communicated to his nervous system had overridden 2 years of Whisperer discipline in an instant. He had covered 40 yards before the figure caught him. The 3 survivors reported that Cole was alive, uninjured. The figure had caught him. He held him immobile for approximately 30 seconds in a grip that the survivors described as inescapable without apparent effort. And then, after what appeared to be a thorough assessment, had released him, pointed toward the tree line, and returned to its patrol pattern. Alpha had read this report 4 times. Then, she had made a decision. She came alone. This was unusual enough that Beta had objected, not loudly, because Beta didn't do things loudly, but with the sustained, physical presence of a man planting himself between his leader and a direction she intended to move in and requiring acknowledgement before he would shift. Alpha had looked at him with the expression that ended conversations and said, "If it wanted Alexandria destroyed, Alexandria would already be destroyed." Beta had moved. She came alone in the early morning of day 19, while walking with a small group of walkers along the tree line south of Alexandria's eastern wall until she was within clear sight line of the figure on the wall. Then she stepped away from the walker group, removed the walker skin hood, and stood in the open. And waited. The Slayer had been tracking her for 11 minutes. The walker's skin camouflage was effective against human observers. Smell masking, movement mimicry. Fighting in Hell's environments, where demonic deception operated on levels that made walker skin look like a Halloween costume, it was transparent. Living biological matter had a heat signature, a cardiovascular rhythm, a neurological activity pattern that no amount of behavioral mimicry could replicate. The suit had flagged her the moment she entered sensor range. Tagged her as living human, covert approach, non-aggressive posture, and tracked her through the tree line with the patient attention he gave everything that warranted observation rather than immediate response. When she stepped out of the walker group and removed her hood, he was already looking directly at her. He came off the wall, not running. The measured, deliberate pace he used when approaching unknowns that had self-identified rather than been caught. He covered the distance between the wall and her position in the open field in under a minute, stopped 10 feet away, and looked at her with the full attention of his visor's assessment systems. Alpha looked back. She was, the Slayer's assessment registered, not afraid. Not in the way that Wade had been afraid. Not in the way that most people in this world were afraid of him. The reflexive, autonomic fear of a nervous system encountering something outside its experience. She was controlled. Her breathing was slow. Her posture was neutral. She had come here with a specific purpose, and she was executing it with the discipline of someone who had burned away everything that didn't serve survival a long time ago. She spoke first. "You've been in my territory for 19 days, she said. "I'm one of my scouts' nerve. Released him, one of my scouts' nerve. Released him, which tells me you make distinctions." She paused. "Most things that kill the way you kill don't make distinctions." The Slayer said nothing. "I'm not here to negotiate," Alpha said. "I'm here to assess. There's a difference." She looked at the Praetor Suit with the same flat appraisal she gave everything. Not intimidated, not impressed, simply cataloging. "You're not from here, not from this world. Whatever here means to something like you." Another pause. "The people inside that wall, they think you're an asset, a weapon they haven't committed to using yet, but are keeping warm." Her eyes moved to his visor. "I want to know if that assessment is accurate." The Slayer looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that Alpha had not anticipated. He reached up and released the visor seal. A partial elevation, not full removal, enough to expose the lower half of his face. Enough to communicate that he was choosing to be seen rather than being forced to be seen. The face beneath was weathered in a way that went beyond age, marked by a particular kind of permanent alertness that Alpha recognized because she saw it every morning in her own reflection. He had been at war for longer than she had been alive. Alpha recognized that too. "You're not theirs," she said. Not a question. The Slayer lowered the visor back into place. Alpha looked at him for another moment, processing. Then she said something that she had not planned to say, that emerged from whatever remained of the human being she had not entirely managed to eliminate. "There's a horde coming, larger than anything your friends inside that wall have seen. I can tell you where. I can tell you when." She paused again, and something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite calculation and wasn't quite conscience, but existed in the territory between them. "I want to see what you do with it." She put the hood back on, stepped back into the walker group, and was gone. The Slayer stood in the open field for 90 seconds after she disappeared. Running assessment. And then he turned and walked back to Alexandria's wall with the specific purposeful stride of someone who had just received operational intelligence and was already planning what to do with it. Behind him, 300 yards into the tree line, Beta watched from the shadows with his arms crossed and his expression doing what Beta's expression always did. Communicating, without words, that he thought this was a mistake. Alpha, moving silently through the dead, did not respond. She was thinking about the face she had seen beneath the visor, about the specific quality of permanent war that she had recognized there, about the distinction between something that killed everything and something that killed selectively, and what that distinction meant about the nature of the thing she had just spoken to. She was thinking that she had possibly made an error in judgment. She was thinking that it had been worth making. The Horde numbered approximately 800. Alpha had not lied about the size. The Slayer's long-range sensors confirmed the count at just over 800 individual walkers. A mass accumulation that had been building for weeks in the river valley 12 miles northeast of Alexandria, fed by smaller clusters migrating from depopulated townships along the Chattahoochee. It was moving southwest at the pace all hordes moved. Patient, inevitable, or the geological momentum of something that didn't know it was supposed to stop. At its current trajectory, it would reach Alexandria in approximately 36 hours. Rick had received the intelligence with the controlled stillness of a man absorbing a body blow while maintaining his footing. Not because 800 walkers was an automatically unsurvivable scenario. Alexandria had faced large hordes before, had developed protocols, had people who knew what they were doing. But 800 walkers arriving while Negan's tribute schedule was already strained, while community resources were stretched by the additional logistical demands of housing a guest whose caloric requirements alone had measurably impacted their food projections. While the psychological weight of the savior situation continued to compress morale in ways that didn't show up on any supply manifest, but showed up everywhere else. The timing was, in the specific taxonomy of apocalypse problems, deeply inconvenient. "How did you get this information?" Rick asked. The Slayer had communicated the Horde's existence, location, and trajectory through the combination of methodical gesture and terrain indication on the map table that had become his primary communication medium with Alexandria's leadership. He had pointed to the river valley. He had indicated direction and approximate speed. He had shown the number with his hands. "Hum walls," Michonne said. "Not accusatory walls," Michonne said. "Not accusatory. Factual." "He goes outside the walls every day," Daryl said from the corner. Nobody stopped him. "Nobody can stop him," said Aaron, which landed in the room with the particular thud of a true statement that nobody had wanted to be the first to say out loud. Rick looked at the map. at the trajectory, at the arithmetic of walls and fighters and ammunition in 36 hours. Then he looked at the Slayer. "Can you handle it?" he asked. It was a direct question, genuinely meant, not the manipulative deployment of flattery to coerce compliance, but the operational query of a leader doing triage. Rick Grimes had stopped wasting words sometime in the second year of the apocalypse. He asked what he needed to know, and the Slayer looked at the map for a moment. Then he picked up the pencil that Eugene had left on the table and drew a circle in the river valley, well away from Alexandria. He tapped the circle once. "You want to meet it there?" Michonne said, "before it reaches us." He tapped the circle again. "Alone," Rick said. The Slayer set the pencil down. He left before dawn. Daryl was on the wall when he went, had been on the wall most of the night, which was not unusual for Daryl, who had a complicated relationship with sleep that the apocalypse had not improved. He watched the armored figure move through Alexandria's gate with the dimensional storage carrying the full arsenal, the fabricated melee weapon secured across the back of the Praetor Suit, moving at a pace that covered ground faster than it looked like it should. Daryl watched until the darkness absorbed him. Then he sat on the wall for a while, thinking the specific thoughts that Daryl Dixon thought when he was processing something that didn't fit any category he'd developed for processing things. He had grown up in a world that had categories for most things, most bad things particularly. He understood violence. He understood loss. He understood the specific texture of people who had been through enough that the ordinary markers of personhood, warmth, humor, the reflexive social performances that most people ran automatically, had been worn down to something harder and quieter. He had recognized that texture in the Slayer on the first day because he saw it in his own reflection. What he didn't have a category for was something that had been through so much war for so long that it had come out the other side of whatever that process did to people and arrived somewhere that wasn't broken and wasn't healed, but was simply resolved, complete, moving with a purpose so absolute that nothing in the environment could create uncertainty, because uncertainty required the possibility of something mattering more than the mission. He thought about what the mission was, here, in this world, with these walkers. He thought about what it said about a being that had fought the lords of hell, that it had come to this place, this gray, exhausted, deeply human catastrophe of a world, and just started doing the work. And the river valley was a natural channel that funneled the Horde's movement between two ridgelines, compressing 800 walkers into a mass approximately 60 yards wide and extending nearly a quarter-mile back from its leading edge. It smelled, at 200 yards, like everything the apocalypse smelled like. The specific biological signature of mass decay that survivors learned to read the way sailors read weather. At 100 yards, the sound became present. The collective drone, the shuffling percussion of 800 sets of feet moving through grass and mud. The occasional moan that the mass produced not from any individual voice, but from the aggregate of all of them. The Doomslayer stood at the mouth of the valley at first light and looked at the Horde with the expression, had anyone been present to see it, of a man reviewing a morning's work schedule. He reached back and brought the super shotgun forward, checked the load, checked the reserves. He ran the ammunition calculation one final time with the precision of someone who had made peace with the numbers. He had enough for approximately 60% of the Horde at current efficiency ratings. The remaining 40% would require melee, the fabricated weapon, the chainsaw at selective intervals, and whatever the Praetor Suit's physical systems could deliver at sustained output. It was, by any rational metric, an absurd tactical situation. He walked into the valley, and the leading edge of the Horde registered him within seconds. the living flesh signature triggering the collective attention that walkers directed at warmth and sound and the specific electromagnetic presence of a beating heart. The front ranks turned, began moving toward him with the unhurried momentum of something that had no concept of what it was walking toward. The super shotgun fired. The sound rolled up the valley walls and came back as echo, layering over the next shot and the next. A sustained percussion that sent birds erupting from the tree lines on both ridges and carried across the Georgia morning for miles in every direction. He moved into the mass. Not stationary, never stationary. The constant fluid advance that kept the maximum number of targets in front rather than surrounding, that used the valley's geometry to prevent encirclement, that maintained the specific tempo of controlled annihilation he had developed across an eternity of exactly this. When the super shotgun's reserve hit critical, he stored it and brought the fabricated weapon forward without breaking stride, transitioning from range to melee with the seamlessness of someone for whom the distinction between weapons was purely logistical. The weapon connected with the leading walkers in controlled, efficient arcs. Skull, skull, skull. The brutal geometry of melee combat at superhuman force levels, reducing each individual engagement to a fraction of a second. Just 800 walkers. He thought of nothing except the work. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, Daryl's radio crackled. He was still on the wall. He had not gone inside. He had his crossbow and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and he was looking northeast at the tree line with a particular quality of attention that was less watchfulness and more waiting. Hoping, though he would not have used that word. The radio crackled, and then there was nothing on it. No voice, because the armored figure moving back through the Georgia morning toward Alexandria's walls didn't use radios. But Daryl saw him emerge from the tree line, moving at the same measured pace he'd left with. The fabricated weapon secured across his back, the Praetor Suit showing new impact, scoring from the sheer mass of engagement, but no structural compromise, moving through the field toward the gate. Alone. Daryl keyed his radio. "Rick." "Yeah." "He's back." A pause. "The Horde." Daryl looked at the figure covering the last 100 yards across the open field, at the absolute, purposeful quiet of the Georgia morning behind him, at the complete and total absence of anything following him back. "Gone," Daryl said. "Negan came back on a Sunday with 12 vehicles and a problem. The problem was not, on the surface, the armored figure that had been residing in Alexandria for 23 days. The problem was what the armored figure's presence had done to the specific psychological infrastructure that Negan's entire empire ran on. Negan understood, with the clarity of someone who had built power from nothing using psychology as his primary construction material, that his organization did not run on violence, and it ran on the credibility of violence. The unshakable collective belief that resistance was futile, that Negan's capacity for consequence was absolute, that the calculation of compliance versus defiance always resolved in the same direction. The sanctuary's population believed this. The satellite outposts believed this. The tribute communities believed this. Wade had come back from Alexandria and filed his report with the careful, selective omissions of a man who understood that certain information created problems for everyone involved. But Wade had filed the report in front of 6 other saviors who had been in the courtyard, and information in the sanctuary moved the way information always moved in closed hierarchical systems. Imperfectly, incompletely, but inevitably. Within 48 hours, the story had traveled. Within a week, Negan could not let that version of events, had held it, had made Negan still. Negan could not let that version of events calcify into accepted history. So he came back with 12 vehicles and a problem. And the problem was that he needed to resolve the narrative before the narrative resolved him. Rick met him at the gate. This was deliberate. Rick had been awake since 4 in the morning when the scout's radio call had come in with the vehicle count. And he had spent the intervening hours doing what Rick Grimes did when he had limited time and imperfect information and decisions that needed to be made before the situation made them for him. He had talked to Michonne. He had talked to Daryl. He had looked at the map and the supply manifest and the census of fighters and the arithmetic of what a direct confrontation with Negan's full available force would cost even with a significant tactical advantage. He had not talked to the Slayer, because the Slayer had been gone since before dawn on a perimeter sweep that had started taking on the character of something more purposeful than routine. Longer range, different directional pattern, the systematic mapping of an operational area rather than the maintenance of a defensive perimeter. Rick had noticed. He had not interrupted it. Negan stepped out of the lead vehicle with Lucille and the smile and the leather jacket and the full performance. And Rick noted with the quiet attention he gave everything that the smile was working harder than usual. More deliberate, less automatic, the performance of ease rather than ease itself. "Rick," Negan said. "Beautiful morning." "Negan?" "I've been thinking," Negan said, walking toward the gate with the cadence of a man who had rehearsed this. "About our arrangement, about how things are going, about the fact that we've built something genuinely impressive together." He gestured expansively at Alexandria's walls, the implicit claim of co-ownership landing with its intended weight. And that impressive things sometimes need to evolve. Rick waited. "Your friend," Negan said. "You're the big quiet one." He stopped 10 feet from Rick and looked past him into the courtyard with the deliberate casualness of someone checking whether the thing they came for is where they expected it to be. "I've given this a lot of thought, and I've decided that the right move, the smart move, the move that works out for everybody, is for him to come to the sanctuary. Full accommodations, my best people, everything he needs." The smile settled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And this isn't a request, Rick. I want to be clear about that. I'm being polite because I respect what we've built. But this is how it's going to go." Rick looked at him. "He makes his own choices," Rick said. "Everybody makes their own choices," Negan said, "right up until the moment they don't." He tilted his head. "Where is he?" "Perimeter sweep," Rick said. "He does them every morning." Negan looked at him for a long moment, reading him, running the assessment that Negan ran on everyone. Remember the continuous evaluation of truth versus performance that had kept him ahead of every challenge to his authority for 3 years. Then he nodded slowly and walked through the gate into Alexandria's courtyard, and his 12 vehicles followed, and the saviors deployed into their practiced configuration, and the community gathered in the specific way that communities gathered when Negan arrived. Present because absence was noticed and noted and remembered. Their faces arranged into the careful neutrality of people managing fear without showing fear. Negan walked to the center of the courtyard and waited. 20 minutes passed. The Slayer came through the gate. He stopped when he registered the configuration. 12 vehicles, 40-plus saviors in tactical deployment. Negan in the center of the courtyard with Lucille and the expression of a man who had committed to a performance and needed it to land. And the Slayer's visor swept the full scene in under 2 seconds, cataloging, assessing, filing. Then he walked toward the armory, his habitual position, the spot he had occupied since day 2, and took up his usual stance. Negan watched him cross the courtyard with the careful expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this moment and was now running rapid assessment of which version he was in. Then he walked toward the Slayer. He stopped 6 feet away, not 8 feet, not 10, 6. a deliberate reclamation of 2 feet of psychological territory, and looked at the visor with the full deployment of his personal authority. "I'm going to make you an offer," Negan said. One time. The kind of offer that people look back on as the moment everything changed for them. He held Lucille at his side, carefully, consciously, not putting it on his shoulder. "Come to the sanctuary. Work with me. I can give you resources, manpower, infrastructure. Whatever you need to do, whatever it is you do." He paused. "In return, you help me keep order. You help me make sure the system that keeps people alive stays functional." Another pause, and now something genuine moved behind the performance. Not vulnerability exactly, but the specific quality of a man who had convinced himself that what he was saying was true. "I keep people alive. Rick will tell you that. The system works. And you?" He looked at the suit, at the arsenal, and at the being inside it. "You need a war to fight. I can give you one." The Slayer looked at him. Negan waited with the patience of a man who had learned that silence was a tool, and that the first person to fill it conceded something. The Slayer looked past him. Not dismissively, not as a performance of disrespect, but with the directional focus of someone whose attention had been captured by something specific. Negan turned, following the look, and saw what the Slayer was looking at, and a woman named Olivia stood at the edge of the courtyard. She was not a fighter, had never been a fighter, was Alexandria's supply manager, a quiet and conscientious person who had survived this long through competence and care rather than combat. She was standing very still because 2 saviors had positioned themselves near her in the practiced way that Negan's people positioned themselves near community members during these visits. Not touching, not threatening overtly, he simply present in the way that communicated consequence. The Slayer looked at Olivia, then at the 2 saviors, then at the full deployment of 40 saviors across the courtyard, then back at Negan. And Rick, watching from 10 feet away, saw it, the thing he had been wondering about since day 1. The question he had never been able to answer because he had no framework for answering it. He saw the Slayer register the hostages in the tactical situation, not just Olivia, but every community member in the courtyard. The children visible in doorways, the fighters who were outnumbered and outgunned. The specific geometry of a situation engineered so that resistance meant civilian casualties. He saw the Slayer understand the constraint, not fear it, not be defeated by it. Understand it, process it with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything, run the calculation, arrive at the result. Then the result was that 40 saviors with weapons near civilians was a problem that brute force made worse before it made better. The Slayer looked at Negan for a long moment. Then he walked past him toward the gate. Not toward the sanctuary, not in compliance. He simply walked out of the situation that had been constructed to force a choice, us with the absolute confidence of something that had decided the situation's terms were not acceptable, and that the correct response was to decline the entire framework rather than choose between its options. Negan turned and watched him go. "Where?" Negan said slowly. "Does he think he's going?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. But Rick, watching the armored figure walk through Alexandria's gate into the Georgia morning, he felt something shift in his chest. The specific internal movement of a man who had been waiting for someone else to demonstrate that the walls Negan had built inside people's minds could be walked through, and had just watched it happen. Negan made his mistake at 3 in the afternoon. It was not the mistake of a stupid man. Negan was not stupid, had never been stupid, and the apocalypse had refined whatever native intelligence he possessed into something sharp and adaptive, and genuinely dangerous. It was the mistake of a man who had operated so long within a system that rewarded a specific kind of thinking that he had lost the capacity to imagine problems that system couldn't solve. His entire architecture of power ran on a single axiom: that every living thing had something it wanted to protect, and that the credible threat to that thing produced compliance. It had worked on communities. It had worked on individuals. It had worked on people who were harder and more dangerous than Negan by most conventional metrics. Because hardness and danger were not immunity to the axiom. They just required more precise targeting of the thing being threatened, and he had identified Rick's thing years ago. The community, the people, the dream of civilization reassembled from wreckage. He had spent the morning believing he had identified the Slayer's thing too. He was wrong. The Saviors moved at 3 in the afternoon, not the full 40. Negan had sent 30 back to the vehicles after the courtyard standoff, a calculated de-escalation that was also a repositioning. The remaining 12 had distributed themselves through Alexandria with the practiced naturalness of an occupation force that had been doing this long enough to make occupation look like hospitality. They were in the infirmary. They were near the food stores. They were outside the residential houses where Alexandria's non-combatants lived. And 4 of them had Olivia. Not violently, that was the precision of it, the craft. No weapons raised, no explicit threats delivered in front of witnesses. Simply 4 large men standing in close proximity to a woman who understood exactly what their proximity meant. In a community that had learned to read that specific language fluently. She was in the supply building, 2 doors down from the armory. And she was very still and very pale, and doing what the people Negan targeted always did. Calculating, hoping, waiting for someone else's decision to determine her fate. Negan stood in the center of the courtyard and waited for the Slayer to come back through the gate. Rick stood 12 feet away, with his hands loose and his face arranged, and the python on his hip, and the full weight of 3 years of Negan pressing down on the part of him that had been building towards something for all of that time. Michonne was behind him. Daryl was on the wall. The arithmetic was bad. It had always been bad. Which was why the moment had not arrived yet, or why the something Rick had been building toward had remained unbuilt. The gate opened. The Slayer came back through it. He had been gone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had left without apparent purpose and returned without apparent urgency. And the Praetor Suit showed no new damage. And he was carrying nothing different than when he'd left. And Rick had no way of knowing what he had done in those 2 hours and 40 minutes, and the particular quality of purposeful resolution in the way he walked told Rick that whatever it was complete. The Slayer stopped just inside the gate and surveyed the courtyard with the full rotational attention of his visor. Reading the deployment, reading the changed geometry, like registering the 4 Saviors near the supply building with the precise threat assessment speed that 2 decades of combat had built into his nervous system below the level of conscious thought. His visor stopped on Olivia for exactly 2 seconds. Then it moved to Negan. Negan spread his hands in the gesture of patient explanation. "Here's the situation," he said, and then his voice carried the specific register he used when he needed a message to be received clearly. Lower than his performance voice, stripped of theater, direct. "I need an answer. The offer I made this morning, sanctuary, resources, purpose, that offer is still on the table. But it has a deadline now." He gestured toward the supply building without looking away from the visor. "And the deadline has a cost if it passes." Rick watched the Slayer. He watched him stand absolutely still for 4 full seconds and process the situation with the same methodical thoroughness he processed everything. He watched the visor move across the courtyard geometry. Saviors near civilians, weapons present but holstered. Negan in the center as both authority and primary target. The careful engineering of a situation designed to make violence by the Slayer equivalent to harm to the people the Slayer had spent 23 days protecting. He watched the Slayer understand the trap completely. And then he watched the Slayer do something that Rick had not predicted and could not have predicted because it required a category of thinking that 3 years of apocalypse survival had not prepared him to anticipate. The Slayer reached into the dimensional storage. Every savior in the courtyard tensed. Weapons came up. Safeties clicked off. The collective nervous system of 12 armed men responding to the movement with the speed of people who had learned that the interval between a hand moving and a consequence arriving could be very short. Rick's hand went to the python without drawing. Michonne moved. The Slayer brought out a radio. Not his radio, Alexandria's radio. The one that had gone missing from the supply building 3 days ago, which Eugene had noted in the inventory with professional irritation, and which nobody had connected to the Slayer because the Slayer had given no indication of interest in communications equipment. He held it up, pressed the transmit button. A voice came back immediately. Multiple voices, clear, organized, coming from different directions, north, east, and west of Alexandria's walls. Voices that Rick recognized with a jolt of cold shock that traveled from his sternum to his fingertips. Kingdom fighters. Hilltop fighters. And something else, something that shouldn't have been possible. Voices he didn't recognize speaking in the clipped, practical cadence of people who had been coordinating for longer than this moment. The Slayer had spent 2 hours and 40 minutes making radio contact with every community within range that existed outside Negan's tribute system. He had spent 23 days mapping the operational area. He had spent the perimeter sweeps, not just clearing walkers, but locating settlements, identifying populations, building the intelligence picture of the regional human landscape with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to Hell's geography. And sometime in the past week, Rick now understood the longer-range, differently directed sweeps. He had made contact. Not with words, because words weren't his primary language, but with demonstrated capability. Cleared walker clusters near Kingdom patrols, neutralized Savior scout teams that had been watching Hilltop's eastern approaches, left the specific evidence of his presence as a message to anyone paying attention that something new was operating in the region. They had been paying attention. The radio crackled. Ezekiel's voice, unmistakable. Alexandria, this is the Kingdom. We are in position. I'm awaiting your signal. Negan's expression did something that Rick had never seen it do. It stopped. Not froze, stopped. The way a machine stops when the process it was running hits a condition it wasn't built to handle. The smile was gone. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was the face of a man doing rapid, desperate calculation on numbers that weren't resolving the way they should. How? Negan said, quietly, genuinely. The Slayer looked at him, and Rick understood. Finally, completely. What the Slayer had been doing for 23 days. Not adapting, not surviving, not waiting. Building. With the patience of something that had planned campaigns across dimensional scales. With the methodical intelligence of a warrior who had dismantled Hell's entire organizational infrastructure not through brute force alone, but through the systematic identification and destruction of the systems that made Hell functional. He had looked at Negan's empire, mapped it, and found its structural dependency on isolation, on the prevention of coordinated resistance, on the collective belief that no single community could challenge the whole. And he had spent 23 days making that belief false. Tell your people to stand down, Rick said to Negan. His voice was very steady. Tell them to put their weapons down and step away from the civilians. And then we're going to have a very different conversation than the one you came here to have." Negan looked at him. "I'm at the radio, at the visor of the armored figure who had walked into this dead world 3 weeks ago and had done, quietly and without announcement, the thing that Rick had been trying to do for 3 years. Outside the walls, in 3 directions, engines were running." Negan looked at Lucille. For a long moment he held her, ran his thumb along the handle the way Rick had seen him do it 100 times, in the unconscious comfort gesture of a man whose relationship with the bat went beyond the instrumental. Then he looked at the 12 saviors deployed across the courtyard with the slow, assessing gaze of a commander counting assets and liabilities simultaneously. "Stand down," Negan said. His voice was level. It was always level. But it was the level of a man who had made a calculation rather than the level of a man who was still in control of the terms. And everyone in the courtyard heard the difference. And it traveled through the saviors like a current. Weapons lowered. Olivia sat down on the supply building steps and put her face in her hands and breathed. Rick looked at the Slayer. The Slayer was already looking at the gate. North, toward the sanctuary, toward the remaining structure of Negan's empire that a courtyard surrender didn't automatically resolve. Toward the next problem in the sequence with the patient. Forward-facing attention of something that understood that ending one phase of a war was not the same as ending the war. Rick followed his gaze. He thought about what came next. About the sanctuary and its population, not just saviors but workers, people living inside Negan's system because it was the system available to them. About the communities that had just committed to a confrontation that would reshape the region's balance of power in ways that would take years to stabilize. Arrived. He thought about the fact that arrived. He thought about the fact that the being standing next to him had dismantled Negan's psychological empire with radio contacts and cleared walker clusters and 23 days of patient, systematic work, and had done it without asking permission and without explaining the plan and without once indicating that he needed anyone's approval to act. He thought about what it meant to have that in your corner. He thought about what it meant that it had chosen to be there. The sanctuary fell without burning. This was Rick's explicit condition, stated in the first coordinated meeting between Alexandria, the Kingdom, and Hilltop that had ever occurred. 3 community leaders sitting around a map table in Alexandria's converted dining room, with radio contact established to outlying positions and the weight of a decision that would determine the regional future, pressing down on everything. Rick had been clear. The sanctuary's population was not the enemy. The system was the enemy. The workers inside those walls, the people who cooked and welded and maintained the infrastructure of Negan's empire because the alternative Negan had offered them was worse. Those people deserved the same consideration as anyone else in this dead world who was simply trying to survive the available options. Ezekiel had agreed immediately, that with the particular relief of a man whose theatrical persona concealed a genuinely moral core that had been uncomfortable with the tribute arrangement since its inception. Maggie, representing Hilltop, had taken longer, had sat with the map and her grief and the specific, legitimate anger of someone who had paid the tribute system's human cost in the most personal possible terms. She had taken longer, but she had agreed. The plan was not complex. Complexity, Rick had learned, was the enemy of execution under pressure. The coordinated communities would establish a perimeter around the sanctuary. Negan would be brought under the terms of the courtyard surrender, which held because 12 saviors in Alexandria had watched their leaders stand down, and the word had traveled back through Negan's network with the speed that significant information always traveled, to negotiate a transition. Not elimination, transition. On the sanctuary's population fed into the regional network as equal participants. The tribute system dissolved, The organizational infrastructure Negan had built, the supply chains, the manufacturing capacity, the communication network, repurposed for collective benefit rather than hierarchical extraction. Negan had listened to these terms in Alexandria's courtyard, with the expression of a man assembling a new understanding of his situation, from components he hadn't anticipated. He had looked at Rick. He had looked at the coordinated community representatives. He had looked, finally, at the Slayer standing at the courtyard's edge. Not threatening, not positioned for violence, simply present with the absolute permanence of something that had already decided how this ended and was waiting for the human beings in the room to arrive at the same conclusion through their own process. "You planned this," Negan said to Rick. A statement, not an accusation. Why, he planned it, Rick said honestly, with a nod toward the armored figure. Negan looked at the Slayer for a long time. "You don't want anything," Negan said slowly. "From the system, from the arrangement. You just..." He stopped, reassembling the sentence around a concept his framework had genuine difficulty accommodating. "You just wanted it fixed." The Slayer said nothing. "Why?" Negan said. And it was the most genuinely human thing Rick had ever heard him say. Stripped of performance, unstripped of strategy, the bare and bewildered question of a man encountering motivation he couldn't reverse engineer into self-interest. The Slayer looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the courtyard, at Olivia sitting on the supply building steps talking to Aaron, at two children running between houses with the magnificent energy of people who didn't know they were supposed to be afraid right now, at Daryl on the wall with his crossbow and his coffee and his deliberate pretense of not watching everything, at the imperfect and exhausted and genuinely trying community that had given him a gate code and a workshop and a fabrication bench and 3 weeks of cautious, hard-won trust. Then he looked back at Negan. Negan read the look with the intelligence he actually possessed, beneath all the performance, and something in his face shifted into the expression of a man who had just understood something that he suspected he should have understood a long time ago. He handed Lucille to Rick, not dramatically, not as theater. He held the bat out, and Rick took it, and Negan's hand was steady, and his face was the face of a man who had made a decision rather than had one made for him, which was the only kind of decision Negan had ever been able to live with. The transition took 6 weeks, or it was not clean. Nothing in this world was clean. There were saviors who rejected the new arrangement and had to be dealt with in the specific, costly ways that rejection in this world always required. There were communities that didn't trust the framework and needed time and evidence, and the patient, repeated demonstration that the system had actually changed. And there were supply crises and structural failures, and 3 separate incidents at the sanctuary's perimeter that nearly unraveled the entire architecture before it had fully stabilized. Through all of it, the Slayer worked. He cleared the walker clusters that threatened supply routes between communities. He neutralized the savior holdouts who had retreated to the satellite outposts and were running independent operations, not killing them when he didn't have to, which surprised people, and containing them in ways that created opportunities for the conversations that needed to happen. He swept the river valley twice more, preventing Horde buildups before they became crises. He appeared at the locations where the fragile new network was most stressed and did whatever needed doing and moved on without requiring acknowledgement or direction. Eugene had given him a radio. He used it twice, both times to transmit location coordinates of incoming walker clusters to community patrols, to both times in the brief, information-dense way of someone who had determined that these were the specific words the situation required and no others. Daryl rode with him twice, in the 6th week, not by arrangement, simply by parallel trajectory. 2 people who moved through the same landscape in compatible ways, ending up covering the same ground at the same time. They didn't talk. Daryl didn't require conversation from people who didn't have it to give. And the Slayer had apparently identified this quality in Daryl sometime in the first week and filed it under compatible. They cleared a cluster of 60 near the old township road together. Daryl's crossbow and the Slayer's adapted arsenal working the perimeter in the complementary rhythm of people who had spent enough time observing each other's methods to move without collision. When it was done, Daryl had looked at him sideways and said, "Us with the economy of someone for whom 6 words was a substantial conversational investment. You're decent company, you know." The Slayer had looked at him. Daryl had looked back with the expression that was Daryl's version of a smile. On the 43rd day, the rift opened. It appeared at the edge of the river valley at dawn. The same torn air geometry, the same argent-orange bleed into crimson, the same 4-second duration that had deposited the Slayer on Route 85 6 weeks before. In the Praetor Suit's sensors, detected it at 300 yards and identified it immediately. Dimensional resonance matching the signature of the original transition. A return pathway opened by whatever cosmic mechanics had created the original breach. Rick was there. He had been there because Daryl had radioed him at first light with 3 words. River Valley, now. And Rick had learned to treat Daryl's 3-word transmissions with the seriousness of detailed operational briefings. He stood 50 yards from the rift, with Michonne beside him, and watched the Slayer stand at the edge of the pathway home, and look at it with the sustained, considering attention of someone making a calculation that had more variables than usual. The rift held. 4 seconds passed, then 8. The rift was staying open, longer than the original, stabilizing rather than collapsing, as if whatever had torn it was holding it deliberately rather than losing it accidentally. Rick walked forward, and he stopped 10 feet from the armored figure and looked at the rift, and then at the visor, and said nothing for a moment, because he was Rick Grimes, and he had learned that the most important things he had ever communicated had not been said with words. Then he said, "You don't have to go." The Slayer looked at him. "Whatever's on the other side of that," Rick said, "it'll still be there. It's always been there." He held the look. This, he didn't gesture. He didn't indicate the landscape or the community or the network they'd spent 6 weeks building, because the Slayer didn't need indication. This is also something. The Slayer was still for a long time. The rift pulsed, a single urgent contraction that communicated deadline without words. Somewhere on the other side, hell was waiting. The demons were reorganizing. The eternal war was running without its primary combatant, when in the cosmic mechanics that had torn the breach were pulling at the pathway with the insistence of something that understood what was at stake if the Slayer didn't return. He looked at Rick. He looked at the rift. He looked back at the valley, at the Georgia morning light coming through the tree line, at the distant smoke from Alexandria's chimneys, at Daryl sitting on his motorcycle at the tree line's edge, watching with his crossbow on his back and his coffee in his hand, and the expression of someone who had already made peace with the outcome and was simply choosing to be present for it. The Slayer reached up and released the visor seal. Full elevation this time, not partial. He looked at Rick with the face underneath the armor in the full Georgia morning light. What Rick saw there was not what he had expected and not what he had feared. Not a monster's face. Not the face of something that had been consumed by war into something inhuman. A face that was exhausted in a way that went all the way down, that carried the specific permanent weight of someone who had been fighting alone for so long that alone had become structural rather than circumstantial. A face that had, in 6 weeks, found something in this gray and broken world that the infinite corridors of hell had never offered it. Rest wasn't the word. Recognition was closer, and the recognition of something worth protecting that wasn't a mission objective, but a choice. He lowered the visor, turned to the rift, and stepped through. The rift closed behind him like a wound sealing. Rick stood at the edge of the river valley and looked at the empty air where it had been, at the ordinary Georgia morning that had reassembled itself around the absence, at the grass pressed flat in a circle where argent energy had briefly touched a world that had no category for it. He stood there for a while. Michonne put her hand in his. Daryl finished his coffee. What the Doomslayer left behind was not a legend, exactly. Legends require storytellers, and the people who had witnessed those 6 weeks were practical people who dealt in the currency of what worked rather than what was mythologized. What he left behind was structural, a regional network that hadn't existed before him. Supply routes that held because walker clusters along them had been systematically eliminated. Communities that had discovered, through the specific evidence of 6 weeks, that coordinated resistance was survivable. A sanctuary population that was learning, imperfectly and painfully and genuinely, what it meant to participate rather than extract. And Negan, sitting in a room in Alexandria with Lucille gone and the performance finally, permanently retired, beginning the long and uncertain process of figuring out who he was when the system he'd built wasn't holding him up anymore. The Doomslayer returned to his war, to the demons who had written his name in their oldest texts, to the eternal, unnecessary violence of something that stands between humanity and extinction and simply refuses to stop. But somewhere in the Praetor Suit's deep memory, in whatever the armor preserved of the being inside it, Georgia remained.